Okay, thank you for reminding me about that. Thank you for reminding me.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here once again in this long series. And I have wondered whether it is maybe not too long for you people to week after week watch see the same faith and listening to the same guy. But I can promise you that there is light at the end of the tunnel. And next week, it will be the last installment in the series, at least for now. But it's a pleasure to do this. So let me try to put my screen on. We already tried it and it worked. So let's see whether it works now. Are we there?
Yeah.
You're there. You're there.
Good.
Great, Reinder.
Good. All right. So today it is Hans Kuhn. And I must say that this is also a person to whom I have taken a definite liking. He is all the things that you said, Forrest. And I hope that for those of you who have not gotten acquainted with him before, that you will also take a liking to him. And there are some books that I think are so good that all Christians should really read them. So Hans Kuhn. Here he is. He was probably in his late 60s or early 70s when this picture was taken and when he was still in full force. As was mentioned, he was a Roman Catholic theologian who was born and lived in Switzerland, born in 1928 in a place called Sursee, one of 7 children. His father was a shoe merchant and his mother a farmer's daughter. So he was from relative simple background. As a young boy, age 11, he felt a call to the priesthood, and he wrote in his autobiography that as he was going to school every day by train, he was sitting next to a girl that he considered more or less like his girlfriend. But then, having the idea that he wanted to be a priest, he decided that it would be better for him to start staying away from the female sex. He studied at the Gregorian University in Rome and took a special interest in, on the one hand, atheistic humanism of Jean-Paul Sartre, and on the other hand, the theology of Karl Barth. He continued his studies at the famous Paris University, the Sorbonne, still a very elite university, where he got his doctorate in 1957. In the meantime, he had been ordained as a priest in 54. And he started doing a little bit of parish work near Luzern in Switzerland. So he had a little bit of pastoral experience, although not that much. In 59, he was invited by Dr. Karl Barth to come to Basel on the border of Switzerland and Germany to lecture on the theme of the church that is always in need of reform. And that was an important event for him. It was at a time when a lot was happening in the Roman Catholic Church, and Pope John the 23rd made the sudden, unexpected announcement that he was calling a church council, the Second Vatican Council. The preparations that Kuhn made for the lecture served as the basis for a book. The title, The Council, Reform and Reunion, and that actually became an important council document. He was very much involved with the Second Vatican Council, as he was appointed what was called a peritus, somebody with the official status of being an advisor to the bishops and the other people involved with the Vatican, with the council. He held a number of academic posts, became professor at the University of Münster in 1959, just shortly, because soon he was called to be a professor at the prestigious University of Tübingen, which has a Catholic and has a Protestant section. It's interesting to note that Dr. Jan Paulsen, the former General Conference president, studied also at Tübingen in the early 70s. So that was at a time when Kuhn was there, and Paulsen got his doctorate from the University of Tübingen. Now, whether he actually ever met with Kuhn or knew him, I'm not sure. But if I think about it, I will ask him when I talk with him next time. Later on, Kuhn was also the director of the Institute of Ecumenical Research at the University of Tübingen. And that would be a very deep interest of him, especially in his later years. He got in trouble with the Catholic Church, was censured in '79, and lost his license to teach Catholic theology. Well, as Forrest said, he wrote a few books. Well, actually, he wrote 50 plus books, most of them on Christian theology, but also some very important books on Islam and the other world religions. Was a great lover of music. He wrote a book on Mozart and also wrote on science and religion. But Kuhn was also somebody who enjoyed life. He lived in a nice house on the board of Lake Lucerne. He traveled extensively during his life, tried to meet with politicians, with Kennedy and other celebrities. He was a lifelong sportsman, enjoyed swimming and skiing, but most of his time was spent, of course, in teaching at the university and in writing. He always wrote in shorthand, never learned how to operate a computer, and wrote most of his books in his home at Lake Lucerne. It reminds me of one of our Adventist writers, George Knight, who also writes all his books in shorthand and has written all his books in shorthand, and had the services of his wife to bring that into a computer. Well, after his retirement, Kuhn established the Global Ethic Foundation in Tübingen to promote the cooperation and dialogue between the different faiths. I don't know how it works, how one gets an honorary doctorate, but it seems that Kuhn was quite capable of collecting honorary doctorates, because he in total had 15 honorary doctorates. That is not to say that he did not really deserve them. Unfortunately, since 2013, he suffered from Parkinson's disease. And we see that that is a kind of disease that has its victims in all different classes, and people also of such high intelligence and such high skills and capabilities may not escape. He died just earlier this year in the city where he lives, in Tübingen. So that's something about the life of Hans Kuhn. He wrote his autobiography, and you see here the 3 volumes of his autobiography, which I have in Dutch, as you can see. It is strange that the publisher did not get 3 similar bindings for this set of books, but there you are. The first 2 of his 3 the volumes are translated into English. The 3rd is not yet. My Struggle for Freedom, then the period that he was much in struggle with his church, Disputed Truth, and then 2013, the 3rd volume, Erlebte Menschlichkeit. And Kuhn was very worried that he would not be able to finish his 3rd volume, but he did. Erlebte Menschlichkeit, Experienced Humanity. It is translated literally, but whether it will be translated into German, published into English, I don't know. But it's fascinating to read the story of Hans Kuhn in his own words. One does get the impression that he was quite fond of himself in many ways, and but nonetheless, it's fascinating reading. When you look at the titles of his main publications, then you can see what the topics were that had his interest, where his focus was. Just look at this and the next slide, this slide, Justification, by the Doctrine of Karl Barth and theological reflection on that. Then we get into the period of the Vatican Council, book on the Council, the Reform, the Reunion. Writing then about the Church, because that's where his focus is, infallible. Then he gets into more fundamental theological and existential questions on being a Christian. Does God actually exist? The eternal life, sorry. And then he gets into Christianity and world religions. 1987, very important book, Why I Am Still a Christian. And then a couple of other important publications in his later years. Justification was his first book. It actually dealt with the theology of Karl Barth, with justification. And according to Hans Kuhn, the standpoints of the Roman Catholic Church and the Reformation were not that far apart as many people believed. it was endorsed, the book was endorsed by Karl Barth, and he said that basically Kuhn had correctly stated his position. He had understood what he meant by justification. And Karl Rahner, a very important Catholic theologian, confirmed that Kuhn had also correctly given the Catholic position. So Kuhn's conclusion was, and his interest has been his lifelong bringing people together, and his conclusion was that the Protestant and Catholic views on justification are largely compatible. During the Vatican Council, as I already mentioned, he was named the Peritus, or an expert consultant at the Vatican Council. He was named the Peritus by John the 23rd. And so that gave him the opportunity to interact with leading Catholic theologians of the day. Maybe I should mention that the council was also attended by a number of Seventh-day Adventist observers. And I wonder if the council were held today, or if a new council were held, whether the leadership of the General Conference would now allow Adventist observers to be present. There were 3 or 4 people who were there for great length of time. The one who was there all 4 sessions, every single day of the Vatican Council, was Dr. Bert B. Beach, who also wrote a few books about the council and the Adventist view on what was happening there. And he tried to do that quite objectively, actually. Well, taking past history seriously and also noting what had happened since, that became the deep logic of Kuhn's thinking in a number of books, such as The Council and Reunion, The Structures of the Church, The Living Church, Reflections on the Second Vatican Council. So this was a major interest of him for a number of years, and his interest in the church remained very vivid long afterwards. Between the end of Vatican II and some 25 years later, Kuhn wrote 3 major books about the substance of the Christian faith. The church, being a Christian, does God exist? But the church was probably not only it was one of the first, but it was also one of the most important books that he wrote. Presenting the church in a new way by using biblical language and trying to help the church see what the church really is. He suggested that the church should use biblical language. Body of Christ, that's what the church is, and in particular, the people of God. Now, some of you may know that I wrote a book on the doctrine of the church, seen from an Adventist perspective, a number of years ago now. And I wanted to call that book, that was the title that I suggested, I wanted to call that book The People of God. But the editors of the Review and Herald did not think that was a good idea. They felt that that was actually a title that sounded too Catholic. And so then they agreed that the book would be called The Body of Christ. But I really had preferred to call it The People of God. Well, anyway, that's a term that Kuhn very much liked. He wrote about baptism, and there he took the angle of baptism being the commitment of the church towards the individual. Of course, we see that primarily from a different angle, but that is not to say that this particular aspect of the commitment of the church towards the one who becomes a member of the church is very important. Kuhn emphasized all through his life the priesthood of all believers. And for him, as a Roman Catholic, that meant that not only the priest can baptize and administer the Eucharist, but actually every member can in principle do so, because we're all the same, the priesthood of all believers. The clergy is not the boss, is not superior to the laity, but simply represents the laity. Hierarchy, yes, there should be a limited amount, functional hierarchy maybe, but very limited. And the same would be true also for the council. He didn't want the extremes. You know, in Catholicism, you have the extremes very often in history. It's either the hierarchy, the Pope and the cardinals, or people who think that no, everything should be decided by a council. And he didn't want any of the two extremes. Kuhn got in trouble with his church, in particular on the doctrine of papal infallibility. Now, the doctrine of infallibility had only been official teaching since 1870, the First Vatican Council, that actually was not able to finish its work because of political upheaval in Europe, but they did manage to promulgate the doctrine of papal infallibility, which meant that if the Pope makes an official statement on faith or morals, that is infallible. Ex cathedra, it is called. Cathedra being the official seat, the papal throne. So it is only when he speaks ex cathedra that his statements are supposed to be infallible. Kuhn wrote a book entitled Infallible, an Inquiry, in 1971. So it's he probed the theological basis, which he found does not exist. And he found the whole concept very embarrassing thing and causing an impasse in the ecumenical relations, because for other churches, obviously, that would be impossible to swallow. But not only that, it was not only impractical, he found, but it was also lacking theological basis. Now, many regard this not as his best book, actually as one of his weaker books, and some people even feel that it was poorly researched, but it has been influential, and it remained a stumbling block in Kuhn's relationship with his employer, with the Catholic Church. In his book, he used the document Humanae Vitae, that was a what's it called, a papal document that was he felt it was clearly an example of fallible teaching rather than infallible, as it was claimed. And many other Catholic scholars also have never believed that this encyclical involved infallible teaching. And this was, among other things, about sexual relationships, about the family planning and similar aspects. So that infallibility infallible. This and some other things actually became very much the reason for what Kuhn would call Inquisition. And in his the second volume of his autobiography, he spent a couple of hundred pages on this process of Inquisition. It later appeared that the Holy Office in Rome already opened a secret file after Kuhn had written his dissertation and his first book on justification and the teachings of Karl Barth. From the 1970s, however, onwards, so quite a bit later, but in the meantime, the Holy Office seems to have been gathering material. From the 1970s, there was an 8-year struggle with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. There were objections to Kuhn's book about the church. Kuhn was asked to a number of questions, but his answers failed to satisfy the objectors. And there was not only the question of the infallibility, but also about the law of celibacy. Although Kuhn always stayed celibate, he did not agree that that could be demanded from clergy. He felt that clergy should be able to marry. And there were other issues about the role of women, the use of artificial contraception, etc. As a result, eventually, the Pope withdrew Kuhn's license to teach at the Catholic faculty of the University of Tübingen. And of course, that would mean that he could not teach in any Catholic institution of higher learning, at least not in theology. But the University of Tübingen allowed Kuhn to continue to teach there under the auspices of the university rather than in the specific Catholic faculty. And they also allowed him to teach in the Ecumenical Institute. Whatever was happening, Kuhn continued his life long as a practicing Catholic and as a priest, and his ordination as a priest was never taken away from him. One of the things that also takes a lot of space in Kuhn's autobiography is his relationship with Joseph Ratzinger. As we know, the later Pope Benedict XVI. It was Kuhn actually who invited Ratzinger to become a professor at Tübingen. And we should not forget that not only was Kuhn a great scholar, but so was Ratzinger. And Ratzinger has, even in his later years, and even since he resigned from the papacy, written some fascinating books about Jesus Christ, in which Ratzinger shows himself to be a great scholar. Now, we obviously would not agree with everything that he wrote. And by the way, he wrote in his preface to these books, Ratzinger, that he did not write this as a pope or as a former pope, but when he was still pope, he was not writing as an infallible interpreter of the Bible, but he wrote rather as the pastor, as the bishop of Rome. But anyway, this is beside the point. Kuhn invited Ratzinger to become also a professor at Tübingen. And so they were there for a short while, both as professors in the same faculty. However, Ratzinger left Tübingen for the more conservative Regensburg University in Germany. It was only later that Kuhn discovered that somebody he regarded as his friend and a good colleague, he discovered Ratzinger's involvement in the withdrawing of his teaching license. And so the relationship between the two always remained problematic. The popes, Kuhn, of course, worked at the university during the pontificates of a number of different popes. These popes never wanted to meet with Kuhn, but Kuhn did have a limited correspondence with Ratzinger, also during the time that Ratzinger was pope. Fortunately, it became better in later years. In 2005, and in 2005, there was actually a friendly meeting with Ratzinger, who by then had become Pope Benedict XVI. I don't really know how much contact they had in later years, if any. 1974, appearance of the German edition of his most popular book, Christsein, on being a Christian. He writes in his preface that the book is intended for those who believe but feel insecure, and for those who used to believe but no longer apparently believe, but are not satisfied with their unbelief. But he says, he also writes for those outside the church who are unwilling to approach the fundamental questions of human existence with mere feelings, personal prejudices, and apparently plausible explanations. So also for those who feel there must be something more and who are seeking and trying to find deeper meaning. So this has been something also in several of his other books, that he wants to justify Christianity, in particular for those who are at the fringe of the church. And you may be able to understand that that is one of the reasons why I feel very close to somebody like Kuhn, because I feel that is something that is very necessary also in our own community of faith, that we deal with those who are at the fringes of the church and try to make Christianity, Adventism, if you want, a viable option for them. In a sense, it has been said that on being a Christian, this book was a kind of a summa, trying to look at the Christian faith in its entirety and make sense of it for those in these various categories that I just described. His point of departure in this book was not a lot of abstract reasoning, but the concrete situation in today's world. This is where we are. So how do we deal with this world? How do we make sense of things? And if Christianity doesn't make sense, then what are the alternatives? Is there something in the other world religions, in Marxism, in these social movements? And he looks at these various movements and talks about its strengths and its weaknesses. And then if I choose Christianity, what is so special about Christianity? And then he says, Jesus Christ makes the difference. He is special. It's not the Christ of dogma, of piety, fundamentalism, but the Jesus who lived and died in Palestine. And as scholars, we can even discover enough about this Jesus to ensure that he is the one that we want to follow. although he works with the historical critical method, he accepted the historicity of miracles and certainly also of Jesus' resurrection. His later book, a couple of years later, Does God Exist? Existiert God? In German, Antwort auf die Gottesfrage der Neuzeit, reply to the question of God in modern times. And so the translated version 2 years later, Does God Exist? An answer for today. And he says that he wants to convince people that it's not unreasonable to believe in God. It is supportable, he said, at the bar of reason. Now, that doesn't mean that everything can be proven. And nihilism is the most important hurdle, he states, before one can believe in God. And of course, skeptical nihilism is the idea that nothing is certain, that nothing has meaning. And Kuhn says, okay, you can have that opinion. That's possible. And I have no rational arguments to actually say that you're wrong. But on the other hand, if you have this standpoint of nihilism, that is also unprovable. And therefore, against that, I choose to have a fundamental trust in reality. There is something, and that something has meaning. Against this nihilism, he posits a fundamental trust. And then he becomes quite complicated in his argument that has a cognitive element, it has an existential moment, and it has this what he calls a fiducial moment of reliance on that ultimate reality that exists. We must take the decision to trust. It is a voluntary act. You cannot prove everything, but it's not irrational or capricious. So Kuhn builds his case for God upon a fundamental trust in reality. And God must be there. He is the necessary postulate for the free act of fundamental trust. Faith in God gives you this fundamental trust and justifies this fundamental trust. This book has been translated in many different languages, and many people have found that very, very helpful. As time went on, Kuhn wrote more and more about world religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And the key thoughts that are penetrating this book is that there can be no world peace if we cannot find religious peace. And there can be no peace among religions if they don't talk together. They need dialogue. But of course, that dialogue must be based on knowledge of the fundamentals of religion. So people must be willing to actually get to know something about these different religions. And then on that basis, there can be dialogue, understanding, and certainly tolerance and peace eventually. Needed is a world ethos in which that peace has a central place. One of his latest books, 2013, was Was bleibt? Kerngedanke. What remains? Core concepts. Sections of this book. God, the ground and the goal, Jesus, ecumenism, the church, death, world religions, world ethos. There are several theologians, and I know also some in the Netherlands, who towards the end of their life have made some kind of summary of, okay, in the end of the day, what do I really still believe? Because many have, as time went by and as they studied, changed some of their thinking. Some have become more liberal. Some have started as fundamentalists and have ended far from being fundamentalists. Jürgen Moltmann edited a little book in 1997, How I Have Changed. He had his birthday, I'm not sure which birthday it was, and he invited a number of his colleagues and other theologians and asked them to also tell him or tell one another how they had changed over time in their thinking, in some of their core ideas. And that is what Jürgen Moltmann did, and that is what some others did, and one of them was Kuhn. And this was later, the core of these discussions was later put into a little book edited by Jürgen Moltmann himself, How I Have Changed. And I'm quoting here from what Hans Kuhn wrote or said, and which was put in this little book. And this is what Kuhn says: to the present day, I'm very grateful for all that I perceived in Rome. However, of course, at a very early stage, I noticed that some things were just not done. In the end, I could not avoid putting the Roman system in question, particularly in theology. And then I must say that the justification of the sinner in Barthian, so that's Karl Barth's, and Catholic theology, which was the topic of my dissertation, has remained theologically and spiritually central for me down to the present day. And for me, the Jesus of history, the crucified and the risen one, has become central. I have kept myself asking, what distinguishes me, since we are all Catholics, from someone like Cardinal Ottaviani? Don't know whether you have, I suppose you have heard the name Ottaviani in Kuhn's younger days. He was the one who was possibly more conservative in the Catholic hierarchy than anyone. And Kuhn writes in the early part of his autobiography that he and his fellow students would often pray for Cardinal Ottaviani and ask the Lord, and said, Lord, will you open his eyes? And if that's too difficult for you, will you close them forever? Well, anyway, Kuhn writes here, I have kept myself asking what distinguishes me, since we are all Catholics, from someone like Cardinal Ottaviani, and later Cardinal Seper, or finally Cardinal Ratzinger. So these were very conservative people. After all, we are all in the same church. We believe in the same God, the same Jesus Christ, the same Spirit, and yet are quite different and believe differently. These brothers in faith lived spiritually in another world age, in another constellation, in another paradigm. I think that really summarizes where Kuhn was. That on the one hand, he wanted to remain a Roman Catholic Christian. That was his church. And he sensed that after all, they were all believing in the same God, same Christ. But yet he could not deny that in many other ways, and that was a constant problem, they were living in another paradigm. Well, and this is one of the last things that I want to share with you. It's from a theologian, Dual Ravens. Kuhn has often been been asked the question what the church should do with heresy, because Kuhn felt that the church believed in many things that were not biblical, that were heretical. He defines heresy as people or ideas which threaten the core unity of the church. And he notes that the majority opinion does not always equal correctness. The minority is not always the one which needs to be reunited with the majority. In responding to heresy, the reaction should not be simply to reject or attack. Rather, Kuhn points out that there is always an element of truth in heresy. There is something maybe which the heresy is exaggerating or pointing out, even if to an extreme level, that may be highlighting a church weakness that needs to be reviewed and re-examined. And so heresy is really something that must foster dialogue. Majority is not always right, minority is not always right, but when people have an objection and when they point out that something is wrong, most likely there is something that the church need to restudy and need to review. And that is maybe something that we should take along on board as well as Seventh-day Adventists when we look at some of the developments in our own church. A British biographer, Robert Nowell, wrote about Kuhn, perhaps especially for those not in communion with Rome, Protestants, there was always something too good to be true about Hans Kuhn. He combined the very qualities that many of the Catholic Church's detractors regarded as totally incompatible. On the one hand, he had a passion for truth, but then there was a loyalty to Rome. On the one hand, an open-minded willingness to accept the fruits of critical inquiry, and yet an adherence to what from the outside was seen as a closed dogmatic system. Yeah, that is the dilemma with which Kuhn leaves us. Now, some points for our discussion. And you know, when you study the life of Kuhn, should Kuhn have left the Catholic Church and have joined a Protestant church? If he basically felt that, after all, the Protestant position on justification was all right, and if he felt that there was lots in the Catholic doctrine of the church that was really not biblical, such as papal infallibility, etc. Okay, another quite difficult question. If you have a theology teacher who no longer teaches what is understood to be correct doctrine, should that theology teacher be discontinued by his or her church? That's not only a question for the Catholic Church, that's a question for every church. If a church has a seminary, if a church has a theological faculty for which it is responsible, and you have a teacher who no longer believes what the church believes and is teaching that, What must the church do? On the one hand, you don't want to have, you want to have free speech. But on the other hand, if somebody is paid by a church, you also expect that person to be loyal to that church. What inspired, what enabled Kuhn to remain in his church and to continue to contribute to it in such a positive way? That's a question that I have often asked myself. And then has maybe for some of you, your journey in Adventism in some respects been similar to King's journey in his church. Problems with some of the things that the church teaches, but you want to remain loyal to that church because that church has also given you so much. And then, well, I think Hans Kuhn and Roy Branson had much in common. Of course, I've never met Hans Kuhn. I have met Roy reasonably frequently over a number of years. And they very much strike me as being alike in many ways, very pleasurable people, very erudite people, and very critical towards some of the things that that church is teaching, but extremely loyal to the church for which they have been working lifelong. Now, okay, you may disregard that, but maybe some of you think that there may be something in that. So first, this is then a few questions that maybe you want to consider for discussion, but I'm sure there are lots of other questions that the people may have. So I'm coming back to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you heard Dr. Bruinsma. We are now at 11:27, 37. We could come back at 11:40 and we'll start our question and answer. Monty will be handling the queue today. And remember, we started a new process last week that you have 2 minutes to ask your question. And then we would like to alternate between men and women where it indicates such. So if you would just raise your hand at this time or during the break, and Monty will pick you up. And so I guess we're going to let you go to your break right now, and we'll see you in about 10 minutes at 11:40 Pacific time. Okay.
And I'm gonna be taking my break for about 5 minutes. I'll be back at 11:35 and start taking down names. But you can if you want to just raise your hand electronically now, we can start that process.
Okay. There we go. Okay, thank you again. Monty, to you.
All right. Reinder, thank you very much for your presentation. Let's hear what George Tichy has to ask of you.
Okay, first, Forrest, I heard a few weeks ago that the text that you just read was actually part of the plagiarized portion there. So we have to check it out.
Let's see
just for the record.
Start with.
Okay, Dr. Bruinsma, thanks for the great presentation again. My point is, or question basically, how do we balance, you mentioned it at the end about loyalty to the church, the balance between honesty and loyalty in the context that we are going through in our church these days. It seems that the problem of Ellen White is popping up in several places very strongly. And there's a problem for many people about, they want to be honest to themselves and to God, and they're trying to be loyal to the church. How can they balance that, in your opinion?
Yeah. I hope that you realize that I do not have the answers to all questions. And this is a very, very difficult one. The question that I asked at the end in the last slide had in particular to do with those who teach theology in our Adventist universities and other institutions of higher learning. How much can they say? How far does free speech and academic freedom go on the one hand? And where must loyalty to the institution come in? I think that most realize that when you are working for an institution, when you're working, that you have, and they're paying you a salary, that you will have to demonstrate a basic fundamental loyalty to that institution. And if you feel that you cannot conscientiously maintain the main elements of what you're supposed to teach, if there is too much of a discrepancy that you cannot, in all honesty, do that, then I think you ought to resign. On the other hand, of course, when you are given the when you're given the privilege and the duty to train and to help people think, and when you're part of the academic community that a church has, you must also have a certain amount of freedom. You must be able to develop. You must be able to question. And you must do so in a responsible way. And you do not have to say everything at all times to everybody. You have to be responsible. You have to be, when you're a teacher, you have to be aware at what stage the student is that you're talking to. So there is a different balance, a difficult balance. It is clear to me that at the moment, we have shifted far too much to the fact that we are required to toe the line, not ask questions. That is very clear, and that is what's happening at the moment. And that is very frustrating. And that in the end is very hurtful to the church. Now, for all of us as believers, there is a balance also in a different but similar way. We must be able to grow in our faith. We must be able to ask questions. We must be able to read and question. But loyal to the church, yes, not if we have questions, not asking them at the wrong points to the wrong people. There is a certain amount of responsibility that we all have. And there may be a point where we say, well, we really don't agree with this. We have to find another spiritual home. That can happen. But I would hope that there can be a balance where we can ask questions, when we can have different viewpoints, but yet be united. And, it's for that reason that I also read that statement that Kuhn said when they had this birthday party with Moltmann, that even though he had great differences of opinion, he was still talking about those other people as his brothers. And that's where I try to remain in my relationship with the church and with those who work in the church, leaders in the church, although we maybe have vastly different viewpoints in many ways.
All right, thank you. And
Thank you.
George, thank you for modeling for us, making a brief comment and a single question. I appreciate that. You got us off on a good foot.
Yeah, I have 3 seconds so left. So yeah,
Oh,
I think
yeah, but I'm not keeping time, so you don't. But do you have a follow-up question?
no, just a support. We are here to listen to the presenters' ideas, not to make long statements. And that's my point only.
Okay, let's move on to, and I just want to let Andres and Peter know that I've noted your hands, and so I've got you in the queue. And we're going to go to Anastasia now.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I want to really thank so much Dr. Larson for hosting, Dr. Bruinsma and other presenters, and Dr. Bruinsma so very, very, very much. I appreciate it, especially today, because I'm one of these people that I don't want to say I choose here and there, but I believe that I can participate. I love to participate in places like in Loma Linda, like this class, and get feedback and knowledge without being labeled just as one thing. You answered on the gentleman, you answered the question that I also had. So I will make a short statement, if I may. As Confucius has said that estrangement happens when each side does not only listen to one another, but understand what the other person is talking about. And thank you so much for this service today about us understanding others that are not like us. And I want to say that Loma Linda has been wonderful, even in the old times when I was teaching and I had some differences. I was never censored. They also gave me great recommendations and everything. But going back to the last thing about Dr. Branson, yes, if I had more Dr. Bransons and more like Peter and Lydia and Dr. Larson and all these people, and if there was some elasticity of the institution of Adventism, it wouldn't have been necessary to belong just to the one or the other. And I have to say that my Greek Orthodox Church has given me that elasticity when I was very sincere about certain things that I disagreed or anything, but welcomed me back with very big arms. And so we kind of need to belong, but also maybe we need to belong to more than one thing. And thank you very much. I talked too much, but actually I left. I could have gone into medicine when I came here, but I did go into, well, classicism, Christianity, and existentialism about all these questions that I've had since many, many years. I want to thank you very much. And I miss Dr. Branson, but I feel very blessed that we have Dr. Larson's class, the people here, each one of you. And I want to thank you very, very much. And I appreciate you extending your tent to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Anastasia. Next up, we have Terry.
Yes, thank you again for a great presentation. I really always enjoy them. You mentioned that in the presentation and also in the videos that we listened to, that he touched a lot on ecumenicalism. And I know that you also, I think you mentioned that he thought that there was a lot of truth in heresies. I've read a lot of heresies and always felt the same myself.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible for a sectarian organization like us to be tolerant enough of diversity to make a foundational appeal of a God for everyone? Because it seems to me, and someone just mentioned that other religions also have the same foundational beliefs. They believe the same ethical principles that he taught. Can we accept everyone on that basis and be tolerant within the organization of that?
Well, is it possible for a sectarian organization to be tolerant of diversity?
Yeah.
The answer to that question, it seems to me, is no. That is, I would say, one of the definitions of sectarianism, that it can only focus on itself as having the truth. I thought that our church was on its way from sectarianism to non-sectarianism. Lately, we have problems with that, and some want us to go back to a more sectarian stance. And unfortunately, in many quarters, they're quite successful. And so I hope and pray that that direction can be switched again, and that we can return to a much more tolerant and less sectarian attitude. Now, to say that you have the truth is different from trying to present Christianity with some different emphases and some special foci. And that's how I have always seen my church, as that is its role as Christians among Christians, to place certain emphases, to focus on particular things, and to be an extra voice in the choir of Christianity. And that's how I will continue to try to see my church. That is what I would like my church to be. But to if you say you have the truth in all respects, and then of course everybody else is wrong, whereas at the very least we would hope that the others would see that we have some points that are worth considering, and that we may look at some others and wonder whether perhaps we could try, we could learn a few things from them.
Just to follow up on my thought there, it seems to me that in the scripture we read that Christ said that he put the kernel of faith in all people. All people had a measure of faith, and it manifests itself in the fact that all people have a concept of a higher being.
Mm-hmm.
That means that we have a truth, but we don't have all the truth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Terry. Appreciate that question and the response that it brought out. Next up is Simona.
Thank you. Sorry, I had some internet problems, so it kicked me out for a moment. There is one thing that has been puzzling me for a very long time, and that's why are conservatives always presented as the ones who are the true representatives of the faith, when by definition, majority of every church or every community, every political party, you name it, any kind of human group is by definition consists of moderates. And so how do we maintain growth if this idea of what is right and what is true is always by this group of people who believes that they hold the corner on truth?
Mm-hmm. Well, how am I going to respond to that? You know, those who tend to be more conservative and tend to feel that they are closer to having a full measure of truth than those who are more moderate and those who are even less than that in their view, liberal, as they often are called. And what we find in most organizations, I think, and we certainly also find in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that those who are on the very orthodox side, they feel they must fight for what they have. And they are often prepared to go quite far in terms of giving their time, in terms of giving also of their money, in being emotionally involved. Whereas the people who are less inclined to claim the full truth and who are willing to ask questions and who are more tolerant of diversity, they often do not have that same kind of fighting spirit, and they are more inclined when things get a little difficult to just disappear. So that is, I think, a process that we see in many churches, and that we unfortunately also see in our church. That those who really think that they have the truth, they're going to stay around, or they may form their own club. Those who get tired of some of the hassle that is going on, they just tend to disappear quietly. That's what I see as a very major dilemma. Have I answered your question to some extent? I'm not sure that I have, but I've tried.
It actually validates, you know, something that I feel is true, and that's that there is very loud minority that is willing to fight to the end for things that are probably not worth fighting for, while people who should be fighting are just leaving the podium to those who are passionate, even if they're wrong.
Yeah, right.
Okay, thank you, Simona. Next up, I have not had any, let's see. I just want to give people an update. I think the only person I've added is Eduardo to the list, but next up is Andres.
Thank you. As a way to say thank you to you, Reinder, I would like to answer your penultimate question, because I didn't have the privilege of meeting Dr. Branson. The answer is clearly yes. And it surprises me how we have so similar journeys at times, and think we are so different from the rest of the world. But this tension of loyalty and following your own insight is a difficult one, is a tricky one indeed, especially if you're teaching at an institution of higher learning. My question, however, is not so much on the interchurch dialogue that Kuhn was all about, but towards the end of his years, as you pointed out, he was going beyond the interchurch dialogue into the world ethos, Stiftung Weltethos, the foundation for a unique or unified ethos for all world religions, if you want. And I just wondered whether you would comment a little bit on the concept of syncretism here, or what is that something you have to expect with old age to come eventually, so to speak? Because it's a sign of his maturity in Kuhn's life, I guess. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a sign of old age, probably, that towards the end of your journey, you are asking that question that he asks now, was bleibt? In the end, what is really significant? And I hope that it's not only theology professors and pastors who are asking that question, but that is a question that we all ask. We are Christians, and yes, we are Seventh-day Adventist Christians. And of course, we have a long list of 28 fundamental beliefs. And we have a whole lot of other things that play an important role in our church. And it's surprising that it's sometimes easier to deviate from one of the fundamental beliefs than from one of our other traditions. But so we all have that. But I think that when we come to the end of the journey, we have to ask ourselves, now, was bleibt? What remains? What is really important? And then if I make a little list for myself, it's a lot shorter than 28. And I think that is something that I think we not only do, but most of us do, but we should do. We should. Whether the other part of your question, do we get more tolerant towards other views? And does that even include non-Christian views? One of the things that I learned from what Kuhn said is that you must have dialogue. Now, you know that we used to have official dialogues between Adventism and some other religious groups, and those have stopped, very, very unfortunately. But in order to have dialogues, and also to have dialogues on an individual basis as believers with other people around us, the key is that you need to have some knowledge. And that is, I feel, where, well, many of us fall short. I must admit that I have long held lots of ideas about Islam without knowing.
Did Cara tell you that she's leaving the house?
Without knowing very much about Islam, actually. And you realize when you come to know more about these various religions that they are not all the same. And it's within those religions, there is a lot of diversity. And there are lots of things that we can learn from. So, and that is something that I think we must try to nurture more in the church, that we have an interest for people in other religions, in other churches, that we know more about them, so that we also find it easier to see where we have things in common and where we have things where we differ. So, well, that often happens when I answer, I tend to forget the original questions, but I hope I have answered a little bit in in line with what you asked.
Thank you very much indeed. It reminds me a little bit of what you said of Gottfried Osterwal, your fellow countryman. So I was smiling at that part especially. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's good to mention that Andreas is a teacher, a professor at Friedensau University. And it was a pleasure to meet briefly again, just, what was it, 3 weeks ago? And I follow him closely on Facebook. I'm
a theologian, but I'm not teaching in the Department of Theology, though. Well, I'm teaching there, but I don't need an endorsement because I'm teaching in social sciences. Counseling
Okay,
is my area, so
okay.
I'm safe.
But he is unique, and I hope he will forgive me for saying that, in that he is married to an ordained pastor.
Amen.
Okay, thank you very much for that exchange. I want to acknowledge and show my appreciation for people's sticking to brief comments. I think it's fine to share your comments. I enjoy that. Brief and then a single question with moderate follow-up if needed. So thank you, everyone. Dana is up next, and then we're going to go to Peter, and then Eduardo is the lineup I have. So Dana, welcome.
No, I had two things to say, but I'm going to take my round. I'm going to stay in line again. So first, about Roy Branson's and Kuhn, it's amazing how they were both so loyal to the church and had so different ideas from the mainstream church at a certain point. We can even say that they were critical. What kept them in the church, in my humble opinion, their loyalty, but also a sense of identity. They knew that who they were was so connected with their churches that they couldn't leave. They made a decision to stay. And a little bit about their criticism. Their criticism is not betrayal. In my opinion, their criticism is love, is an effort to hold on to the dream of the institution, to hold on to the promise of what the institution can be, to the ideal, to help their institutions, their organizations to be the best they can be in this world, the best image of Christ in the world. So thank you so much, Dr. Bruinsma, for, painting this portrait of Kuhn for us. And, it's something that I will always remember, and I'm considering reading him. If I can
Right.
find.
Well,
Thank you.
I hope that at least some people recognize that these are some of the examples that I have tried to follow in my ministry, to also be critical, and also that is because I love my church, and at the same time remaining loyal to the institution and to the many people that I have come to appreciate within that institution. Thank you.
So Dana, if I understood correctly, we're going to bring you back onto the cycle. Is that correct? All right, I have you there. We'll come back. Okay, Peter, thank you for your patient waiting. It is your turn now.
Thank you again for another interesting presentation. I don't know, I was not here when you discuss about if we can ask one or two, if we have two questions.
We're doing one question and then we'll cycle you back for a second, Peter.
Okay, yeah, I have two questions. Then you can cycle me back for the second one.
Thank you. I have you down.
Okay, the first question is, you mentioned about Hans Kuhn interest in formulating a global ethics. Would you be so kind to talk a little bit about the main ideas that he believed how to formulate a global ethics?
Okay. Well, I cannot really claim that I have read all of these books that Kuhn has written, but Kuhn more and more believed that in order to achieve a measure of peace in the world, religions ought to be able to talk to one another. and ought to try to understand each other rather than fight each other. And as I just said, that he believed that understanding, or at least appreciating, comes from knowing about the other, because there is so much bias, there is so much misunderstanding, there is so much focus on the things that go wrong in different religions, and that is true for Christianity, and that is true likewise for other world religions. But yet we tend to focus on the things that are negative, on the things that are wrong, on the kind of things that religions carry with them from the past, although they are trying to overcome them. And so that is, I think, where Kuhn's emphasis is, that we do not necessarily try to bring them all under one umbrella, but that we see the value from the different world religions, and we give space to the different world religions, and we appreciate rather than fight them. I think, from my understanding, Peter, that is where things add up. And for Kuhn, that did not mean that Christianity was not in a special place. He did not see Mohammed and Jesus Christ as the same. And I think that is the core also for us in our relationship with other people around us, where we live, or in whatever situation, trying to understand and trying to be positive does not require to give up our fundamental conviction that Jesus Christ is different from the founders of the other religions, and what he offers is different from what they offer. Whether that means that ultimately, if they want to be saved, these people, they have to become Christians, that's a totally different question. And we could talk for a long time about that. But it's not all becoming the same, not for Kuhn either.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So in one of my prescribed cycles, I'm going to come back to Dana, and then we'll go to Eduardo and back to Peter. So Dana, you're on again. You got a follow-up.
I just wanted to say that as a chaplain, I feel very close to Kuhn, because the last question was, how is your experience, close to what Kuhn experienced in his life? As a chaplain, I feel very close to him because he was focused on the people on the fringes of the church. Mm-hmm. And I also found a common place with people from very different denominations. And I feel that together with these people that belong to different denominations, have different spiritualities, different experiences, I found myself being part of what Adventists are calling the invisible church, mm-hmm. and what Kuhn called the people of God. Mm-hmm. And it's a marvelous feeling, I tell you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And that is always a very important thing to remember, that we can, as human beings, not determine where God's church, where his people begins and where it ends. That is that's his bird's eye view. We can see where an institution begins and ends, but fortunately God's people extends far beyond human institution.
Okay, thank you, Dana. and Reinder. Eduardo, you're up.
Brother Reinder, I don't see anything wrong with desire perfection. I think that every university, government, institution would love to have perfection or the absolute truth or whatever they want to. Let me read to you Acts 16:17. It's talking about certain woman following Paul, saying, "These men are the servants of the Most High God, which show us the way of salvation." I think she followed them for several days, repeating the same truth. And why Paul rebuked the lady? And one of the temptation of Christ, Satan quote the scriptures. And the idea that I have from Sister White is that Satan wants to come into God's people with certain truth, and then can bring error to the church. And we can see the results of the investigation in France by the Catholic clergy. More than 200,000 victims by the error of celibacy. One error can make so much damage on millions and millions of people. I think that we need to be careful how we accept others with certain truths, and then they can bring error into the group, into our group. I would like to hear your thoughts.
Well, of course, error can bring confusion, and error can misdirect individuals and groups. And so individually and collectively, we ought to be on our guard and be sure that certain wrong teachings do not infect us. Just in the last week, we have heard a lot in our church about an incident that has happened with a pastor who gave a sermon and indicated that a certain kind of rape would be okay if it is your own wife. And it has been analyzed by many, maybe too often, and maybe we shouldn't start talking about that here, but that the basic element there is that the teaching of headship theology came into the church. That was an error, and that has very significant consequences. And that can be true in many ways. Now, where do these errors come from? Well, ultimately, we know where they come from. But they can come from people from outside of our own community, and they can come from people inside of our own community. And we ought to be on the lookout. And if we see that there are such errors, we need to do something about it. Sure. But there are some who would say, and in order to guard ourselves against these errors, We need to have no contact with others. We should not read any books that are written by non-Adventist people, etc., etc., because that's the only way to safeguard ourselves, protect ourselves from errors. Well, that would be stupid. And that has never been the principle that was followed even by our pioneers. And whatever we think of Ellen White, she did read, and not only read, but copy lots of non-Adventist theologians, pastors, etc. So she felt there was something worthwhile that we could adopt. And I think that is where we ought to remain. There is, other people can teach us something. If we have the idea that we can teach others, then let's not think that we have nothing to teach. But yes, critical, and if there are errors, they should be called errors, and measures should be taken.
All right, thank you, Eduardo and Reinder. Peter, we're back around to you, and then we've got Forrest added to the list. So Peter, you're up.
One of the main criticisms of Hans Kuhn against the Catholic Church was about the doctrine of papal infallibility, adopted in 1870. And of course, we can talk a lot about this and historical circumstances in which the Church adopted this doctrine. But I was wondering if he was critical not only about the papal infallibility, but also he was critical about the doctrine of papal supremacy. That's my question.
My answer would be, I don't know. But it seems to me from what I have read that he was at very least very, very hesitant to accept the element of hierarchy to the extent that it was being practiced in Catholicism. He never, to my knowledge, refused to accept that the Pope has authority. But he did not think that the Pope had any absolute authority when it came to defining morals and doctrine. And I think that is something to which I would be pretty close also, that I would acknowledge that leaders in the church, even though they are elected in a different way from what they have in Rome, that leaders in the church have a certain authority. But I have a problem when that is a kind of absolute authority and is not a consultative kind of authority, and is also not including a willingness to sometimes take a step back and say, we were wrong and we must change. Now, that has always been very difficult for most churches. That has been very difficult for the Catholic Church. And the Catholic strategy has mostly been that if they are embarrassed by what they have said in the past, they try to forget about it. And that is also something that we have tried, but our history is simply a lot shorter. And I think it would be a lot better if we would agree that we are all fallible. That is true for all of us, even if we are the leaders in the church, and that from time to time we need to say, well, we have seen this probably in the wrong way, in the wrong light, and we suggest that we take another approach now. So, but how exactly Kuhn thought about the supremacy of the Pope, I'll try to give you an answer the next week.
Thank you. I was very interested in this because they are two different things, and it's very interesting how the idea of papal supremacy evolved. That in the beginning he was just considered primum inter pares. In other words, one of the main bishops. There were 5 centers of Christianity, and Rome was one of them. But then gradually Rome got in importance.
Do you still hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I must connect with my internet was unstable. I'm back again.
Yes, as I said, I was very interested, because the way the primacy of the Pope evolved historically, it's very interesting, and it's a long process.
Yeah.
Because in the beginning, the Pope was considered primum inter pares. But then basically he eliminated the others in importance. The others 4 bishops, because Christianity, as we know, in the beginning had 5 important centers. It was Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople, but gradually the Pope became more and more important.
I'll see whether I have an answer next week. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Peter, for cycling back around. A good example of giving us a second question that's very helpful. Appreciate your patience on jumping back into the queue. Let's see, we have Forrest is the only person I have on my list, so this may be the last question. Forrest.
Hey, thank you, and again, thank you very much, Dr. Bruinsma, for these presentations. I kind of have a similar question to what Peter just asked, and it's about the evolution of doctrine. And I think Kuhn was criticized many times for instance, the issue of the Pope, but other Catholic doctrines or Christian doctrines. And then the issue of heresy. I mean, do you have any comments on how doctrine evolves? I know in my own experience, there's issues. Well, when I joined the church, there were 11, not 28 points. And so that's my contract. But how does heresy and how does the evolution of doctrine evolve in your thinking?
Well, doctrine never evolves in a vacuum. And doctrine, the way it evolves, is always conditioned by the thinking in a particular period and by what is happening around the church. For instance, the fact that we have now further developed number, 6, about creation, has to do with the fact that, of course, there is discussion in society and among people about the issue of creation. And then when a church feels that there is a particular issue where there is a danger that people will have a view that the church doesn't like, or whether there are many people who have already taken a particular route, then the church comes with an attempt to plug the hole. And if you look at early Christianity, the way the doctrine of God evolved, the doctrine of Jesus Christ, salvation, Holy Spirit. It took centuries for these doctrines to really become what they eventually became. And it was each time a heresy that pointed the church that urged them to plug the hole. So unfortunately, there is a tendency, there has always been a tendency in most faith communities to try to plug as many holes as they could. And that becomes then doctrine, creed, etc., because it's felt too risky not to do so. At the same time, doctrine can become too important, and we can lose the sense that doctrine is work, is human work. It is always looking at what we read in the Bible and what we construct from that through human eyes. And we should always, and I think I've said it before in this group, we should always, as soon as we have formulated something, take a step back and say, well, this is our attempt to say it under our circumstances with our knowledge, but we realize that God is much greater and what he does is much greater. And we must always look at that with humility. So doctrine is important. Doctrine will, because it's a human project, will evolve. But then, since it is a human project, we also need to, from time to time, wonder whether maybe we have taken a route somewhere that need to be revised.
Okay, thank you. Before we go to George, Monty, I don't mean to step on your toes here, but I think Ruth had her hand up, physical. Ruth, would you mind, Monty, if we go to Ruth right now?
No, I don't mind that at all. And then I'm planning on going to Jeff or Donna. But yeah, I'm not finding Ruth. I was going to go down and unmute. Send her
She's unmuted right now.
Okay, excellent.
I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes,
we can, Ruth. Go ahead.
Okay. I had the opportunity to work at one time with a Christian conciliation service that was handled by a number of different Christian members that were attorneys. And I was asked to be a member of that particular organization. One of the times we were faced with whether or not the organization would approve of working with people who had problems with divorce. And some folks thought, no, we shouldn't do that. And so we had a committee meeting that was held by persons in charge. And we had an interesting discussion because we did, but there weren't very many women involved. I don't know if I was the only one because there were mostly attorneys who were there, not a lot of women that were attorneys that were there. And we came through to a point where there was realization that if we didn't help the people who needed us in their greatest stress, then maybe we were missing what was needing to be done. And that was a useful meeting that we had. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, one of the persons who had been involved with this particular organization, her husband passed away, and then she became very ill. And but she was a very well-spoken person and had her own ideas about a lot of things, which meant that she was deciding how her event for her service was going to be. And she had a number of pastors that were taking part in that instance. She chose to have one person who was talking about the fact that she was in heaven. Then the next person who came on to preach was talking about the fact that she was waiting for the Lord to come. And I smiled because I knew exactly what she was doing. She was going to get everybody satisfied with however she was going to go.
Mhm.
And I think that that kind of attitude that people can have, that they can reach out with one another, however they are, and meet their needs for the people that need to have their particular concerns addressed is important.
And that very much also depends on the circumstances of that moment. And even though you may want to add something to what you're saying, it may be wiser to wait till a later moment to do so. Thank you very much, Ruth, for that, what you just told us.
Thank you, Ruth. So I'm going to go to the Jeff Donna pair. I don't know who we're getting.
That's always a surprise, isn't it?
You're getting Donna.
It's like a box of chocolates.
I just wanted to go back for a moment to the doctrinal development process, because it seems to me that it's often a pruning process. That is, things are abandoned rather, and in that abandonment, a sort of different take. Within Adventism, certainly, I think, I may be speaking a little out of turn here, but it seems as though the quote sanctuary doctrine, if it's not been abandoned, it's certainly been relegated to the back bench. I think our doctrine, if you will, of creation is changing as more information becomes available. And we're influenced, of course, by other fields, a lot by science. So the doctrine of creation is undergoing a change. I think our doctrine of the eschaton, of the end times, is beginning to change. Reinder, you've just written a book about the second coming. I think our position on that is also changing. I don't look up, not that we have cloudy skies in Southern California very much, but I don't look up the clouds much and start to worry about if what is growing from the size of a man's hand to something else. And then I think, as distinct from doctrinal development, there are cultural changes. I see that I am not the only woman here wearing earrings. And I think there are certain kinds of, yep, there they are. And I see Anastasius as well. Those kinds of cultural changes are also take place, and part of it is I don't know whether some people would think it's not progress. I think being more open and accepting is progress, but that is one of the ways in which development takes place, and that's what I mean. I think it's a pruning process rather than adding and making creating a lot of additional things. That's you could react, right?
Yeah. Well, Donna, it's true that changes are taking place, but whether doctrines are changing, it depends on what you mean by that change. Take the doctrine of creation. Officially, it's changing in one particular direction. On the side of the informed believers, it is often changing in a different direction. And that creates a kind of, what would I call it? It's an unhealthy situation when the official doctrine is beginning to deviate that much from what many people actually believe. And so that creates, in particular on the part of those who are employed by the church, a major difficulty in how much they can say, how much they can, because there is the official doctrine. And there must be a greater preparedness, yes, to change doctrine when the conviction arises that actually it needs to be changed because we know more, etc. But and this is a whole different thing, and we could talk about that until tomorrow morning. But the problem is, we have Ellen White. And as long as she is a major factor in determining our doctrine or our unwillingness to revise our doctrine, yeah, this discussion will go on. Now, of course, we have different opinions as to what extent actually Ellen White should be consulted when it comes to defining our doctrines. But yes, and culturally, yes, things are changing, but things are changing at a very different rate in different parts of the world. And that creates another problem. You live in California at Loma Linda, and you can have earrings. And my wife can have what is it, a necklace. And she has always had, even though often being heavily criticized by my superiors in the division, etc. But we live in areas of the world where we can get away with that. But there's recently again been a very major discussion, even in the US, about the wearing of wedding rings. And so, yes, there is change, but change comes sometimes at a very slow rate. And change is sometimes going backwards. And change is sometimes by simply trying to ignore something. And you mentioned the sanctuary doctrine. Yes, something is happening. But what is happening is that less and less people know about it and are simply ignoring it. But rather than asking ourselves, okay, does that mean that maybe we need to look again at that doctrine? Maybe we need to describe it differently, or well, whatever changes need to be made. Or on the other hand, we must have a better way of teaching people. Certainly the way it's going now is not very healthy, where we keep pushing it, pressing it, but at the same time have more and more people who simply say, well, okay, I don't understand, and it's not very important for me. So, yeah.
Okay, Monty, we are running out of time, and we've got 4 hands up.
I'm talking too long, sorry.
No. But I'm just wondering, should we get to all 4, Monty, you think, or should we just?
Well, where is Reinder?
I'm here.
Well, yeah, but are you okay to answer 4 more questions and then we'll close it off?
Let's have them short, and I'll try to be short.
Okay, and Forrest, I am going to it's George, then Dana, then Simona, then Peter. I'm going to step away and say goodbye to one of my sons who's leaving right now. So if I'm not back for the transition please do that. We have George, Dana, Simona, then Peter, but I'm planning on coming back soon.
All right, thank you. George, go ahead.
Okay, my focus will be on the present truth concept. It seems that someone was very smart in the beginning of our history, Adventist history, and they inserted this concept, bizarre for me, of present truth. This way, the truth, the doctrines will stay volatile and everything could go at any time as time would elapse. So they were protecting, that was a tool to protect against something. What do you think, if you agree with that, what do you think they were most concerned with? Protecting them, protection against what would be this present truth? I would say heresy. For me, it's a heresy anyway. What is your opinion on that?
The idea of present truth was very much linked to the fact that they felt that truth had to be relevant, had to somehow be linked to what was happening in the world around them. And it's actually a biblical term. So I think that it was something that was very, very important, and it's an important concept that we should resurrect, except that we should not take 19th century truth as being present truth necessarily in the 21st century. But in order to actually have something to say in our present age, we must have more present truth. We must be able to more link what we believe, what we say, with what is happening around us. And that means, for instance, that if we have a climate conference in Glasgow, that in that very same period, we do not simply take the Book of Prayer brochure that is only about the third angel's message, the three angels' messages. That may have been present truth in 1880, but that's not present truth in 2021. Now, that is not to say that we should never talk about the three angels' message, but to have present truth, that is the concept of linking what you believe with what is happening in the world around you at this particular moment. And in that way, you make your faith relevant. And I think that is important, particularly in the Western world, if we want to have our young people see the relevancy of our faith.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Dana. Dana, to you.
Yes, hi. So we talked a lot about Roy Branson and Kuhn, and my proposal for Dr. Bruinsma was that he would add another talk at the end of the series about Roy Branson's legacy and what he means, you know, for our church in this line of, you know, very visionary thinkers. Both Roy Branson's and Kuhn fought for the church to stay relevant in today's world and how the church can relate to the world issues. And in the light of Me Too movement, I'm very grateful to Dr. Bruinsma for bringing the Burnett Robinson case into our conversation and how the headship theology brought us to this complete heresy, you know, that he was preaching. So the question for us after this intellectual feast that we had today, the question is, where do we go from here? Because tomorrow or tonight, we are going to go into the trenches. How is what we learn here today going to be relevant and going to change the world tomorrow? It's for everyone to decide, but please don't ignore that. Don't wait until the next Sabbath to enjoy another intellectual feast without doing something in between. And as a guiding light, let's take the verse from Micah: do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God.
Well,
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank
and
you.
thank you, Dana. And what is coming next after this series? That is really up to to David and his club to decide. But I must remind the group that there are also some other places that sometimes invite me to come and talk to them.
I know, but I'm going to advocate for that, to add one more lecture to the series on Roy Branson and his legacy.
Okay, well.
Thank you.
All right.
I second.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I
And
think
then
we're up for Simona.
Yeah, but
I'm
we were
back.
gonna, yeah, okay, Monty, we were gonna do men, women, so it should be Peter now.
All right, well, he came in so far after Simona, I was gonna get
Okay.
Simona, but we'll do Peter. Peter.
In regard to wearing a ring, we discussed that before. I remember that a few years ago, the General Conference came up with an official statement that it's in favor of women wearing a ring. I mean, women and men. And the way it was explained, if I remember correctly, was that, of course, this is a sign that a woman is taken, she's married, and that will prevent from advances unwelcome done by different men. I just want to say that I don't see anything nefarious with wearing a ring. It's historically a custom that is coming from the Roman times. The Romans believed that the finger that we are wearing the ring on, it has some nerves that are connected to the heart. That it's something related to the heart, is nothing I'm about jewelry or pride or I mean hubris, anything like that. It's that's the way this custom came about.
Mm-hmm. Well, again here, the ring is a subject we can talk about endlessly, but I think that the statement that the GC made is that they will not be against wearing a ring where that is culturally something that is advisable. So it's a kind of concession, but it's certainly not a wholehearted endorsement. And when it comes to jewelry in general, of course, in many areas in the world, that is still a very hotly debated issue. And actually, becoming a Seventh-day Adventist is when you are baptized, you throw away all your jewelry. And that is one of the main indications that you are now becoming a Seventh-day Adventist. That is the reality in some parts of the world. But in the Netherlands, it would be misunderstood if tomorrow I would no longer be wearing a ring. So I'll keep wearing it.
Okay.
All right.
All right, our last question or comment comes from Simona.
So this kind of ties in to the question that we somehow need to ask, and that's what is important. I'm going to give you a very brief story. Years ago, I went to a meeting, youth meeting. It was the most transformative experience of my life. When I came out of that meeting, it lasted several days. I understood for the first time what the heaven will look like, where people with different languages and different ideas and different backgrounds come together and worship God in one voice. No matter how different the pitch and how, you know, it was really the most transformative experience. And when we came back to my home church, one of my friends came and said, you know, I was so stressed out because everybody was wearing jewelry. And what I came away with was that while I was focusing on the substance, on what really mattered, some people couldn't see beyond their prejudice. And I think it is important for us to learn to make the distinction between what is important and what is not important. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a very good statement to finish on. And, you know, I would just say that it is easier to focus on some of these external things. It is easier to throw away a ring than it is to become a pleasant and forgiving and tolerant person. So that is maybe sometimes why there is so much emphasis on the external things, because it's something that is relatively easy. It's something that you can do, you can decide to do overnight. It's measurable. And really being a Christian, a follower of Jesus Christ, that is something that has a totally different dimension. And that is the important thing, Simona, that you were pointing to. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Dr. Bruinsma. I'm going to mention next week, we're going to be discussing Dr. Desmond Ford, and there might be some parallels between Dr. Ford and Hans Kuhn. I wouldn't be a bit surprised, but we
I think so.
Huh?
There are parallels. And,
I know.
Yeah, and there is some intentionality there.
Yes. So anyway, thank you again. By the way, I did want to share, I hear again, there's one thing I don't like about Hans Kuhn. I'm jealous of him. Look at that head of hair. Look at that head of hair at 93. I mean, I'm just flabbergasted that someone could have that. I'm jealous. So, but Hans Kuhn is a great man, and I'm glad that we studied him today. I want to thank Monty in a very special way today for his work on that, and we wish the Larsons a good time this weekend. We miss them. And at this time, I'm going to have our benediction, and then I'm going to leave the thing on for about 15 minutes, and then it'll go off. So our benediction is: the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen. Thank you again, and everyone have a good Sabbath, a good day, and good night to the Bruinsmas and you in Europe. So
yes, I wish you all good night.
Thank you.
And also on behalf of Afje, and see you next week.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you going to end recording?